I've always been the quiet one at family barbecues. The girl who shows up late, leaves early, and doesn't say much in between. Most of my relatives don't even know what I do for a living, and the few who think they do usually get it wrong. It's not that I'm trying to be mysterious. I just never felt like explaining myself would make any difference. In a family full of big personalities and louder opinions, there's never really room for nuance. I serve in the Air Force. I fly for a living. But to them, I'm just Isabel, the cousin who wears her hair in a bun, doesn't drink, and rarely joins in when the conversation turns to politics or sports. I learned early on that if you don't say much, people will fill in the blanks for you, and most of the time, they don't paint a very flattering picture. I always made sure to leave my service cap and any unit patches in the car. I spoke in slow, full sentences, carefully editing out the acronyms and the technical jargon. I was Isabel, not the pilot, because the pilot didn't fit the family's frame. Last summer's barbecue is the one that stuck with me. I had just wrapped up a brutal week, 5 days of back-to-back night flights, 0 sleep, and a surprise inspection that nearly wrecked my unit's readiness report. I landed at the base just before dawn, showered in a locker room that smelled like jet fuel and mold, then drove straight to my uncle's house because I'd promised my mom I'd be there. The backyard was already packed when I arrived. Kids running through sprinklers, someone blasting country music from a portable speaker, and the usual crowd gathered around the grill. My cousin handed me a plate and made a crack about me, finally showing up like a ghost from the military. I smiled. I'm used to that. It was what came next that landed like a punch. Uncle Frank, retired Marine, owns a chain of auto shops, never misses a chance to remind people he served real combat time, turned to the group and said, I mean, what does Isabel even do in the military? Filing? Scheduling? Probably just pushing papers behind a desk somewhere safe. Everyone laughed. Not in a cruel way. Not exactly. Just in that easy, dismissive way people laugh when they're used to dismissing you. I didn't say anything. I didn't correct him. I just stood there, holding a plate of ribs I didn't feel like eating, and nodded like it was fine. But it wasn't fine. It wasn't even close. That moment, right there under the shade of the patio umbrella, with the smell of barbecue smoke and sunscreen in the air, that's when something in me went quiet in a way it hadn't before. Not the kind of quiet that avoids attention. The kind that watches, waits, and remembers. I looked at Frank. His disdain wasn't just ignorance. It was rooted in the rigid blueprint he had for what a real soldier, and certainly a real woman, should be. He wasn't rejecting my service. He was protecting his own story, one where his experience was the only one that counted. Frank kept talking, something about how the military wasn't what it used to be. Back in my day, he started because, of course he did, and launched into a half-remembered story about jungle patrols and sleeping with one eye open. Everyone listened like they'd heard it a dozen times. They probably had. I wandered to the edge of the yard, pretending to check my phone. I wasn't angry, not exactly. It was more like this sinking, familiar weight pressing down on my chest. It didn't matter how long I'd served, what I'd done, or where I'd been. In this yard, at this table, I was still just the girl who left home and came back quieter. The truth is, I could have shut him down. I could have told them about the flight hours, the training, the missions they'd never hear about on the news. I could have explained what it's like to fly low and fast over hostile terrain, watching the world blur beneath your boots. But I didn't, because I knew none of it would matter to them the way it mattered to me. Instead, I sat down with a plastic plate of potato salad and listened to Frank talk about how kids today wouldn't last 5 minutes in a firefight. My cousin nodded, chewing ribs. My uncle laughed at his own jokes, and I sat there, surrounded by my own blood, feeling like a stranger in a uniform no one could see. It's a strange thing, being invisible in plain sight. You start to wonder if maybe you imagined all of it, the danger, the responsibility, the grit it took to survive it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just wasn't sure they'd ever be willing to hear it. That afternoon stretched on like something out of a slow-motion reel. The sun burned too bright. The food tasted like cardboard, and every time I looked at Frank, all I could hear was his voice. Probably just pushing papers. It wasn't the words that hurt most. It was how easily they came, how casually someone could erase everything I was with one lazy sentence. And I sat there. I said nothing. I let them believe what they wanted. But inside, something shifted. Not a loud, dramatic crack. Just a small, sharp break. One that didn't bleed, but wouldn't quite heal. The mission came in just after 0200. We'd been on standby for over 16 hours, and everyone was running on caffeine and tension. Word came down that a SEAL team was pinned outside Raqqa, caught in a kill zone with limited air cover and no way out on foot. The operations floor was a study in cold, fluorescent efficiency. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone. Before moving to the jet, I stood for a moment, letting the sound of my own breath steady me. This was my sanctuary, a place where my qualifications mattered more than my gender or my name. I remember looking at the coordinates and knowing right away it wasn't going to be clean. The terrain was hot, uneven, and crawling with hostiles. Command said the odds weren't great, but we were the only bird close enough with a shot at getting them out alive. I didn't hesitate. I double-checked the loadout, locked into the cockpit, and gave my co-pilot a single nod. We were wheels up in under 10 minutes, slicing through the night with every alarm in my head firing. I've flown into some bad places, but that one still hums in my blood. We had no time for second guessing. The LZ was surrounded by small arms fire and lit up like a bonfire. I had to fly below radar profile, hugging the ground so tight I could smell the sand burning off the engines. My stick was locked. One mistake and we'd be smoked in a crater. They didn't teach this part in training. How to fly steady when your heart's in your throat. How to listen past the static and trust the instincts that saved your life once and might have to do it again. We touched down hard, skids grinding over rock. My crew moved fast. 2 SEALs were wounded. One barely conscious. The others provided cover while we hauled them in. I stayed at the controls, hands locked, sweat pouring down my back. Rockets whistled overhead as we lifted off. I banked sharp, climbed fast, and punched it out of there like we'd stolen something. The aircraft took a hit on the tail, but we made it. No one died that night, not on my watch. When we landed back at base, the SEAL team came to find me. One of them tall, quiet, the kind who doesn't smile easily, looked me dead in the eye and said, "You flew like death herself. Cold, precise, untouchable." Another guy behind him muttered, "Reaper Queen." Hours later, after the debrief and the maintenance checks, I finally took off my helmet. The air on the flight line was cool and thin. I could feel the tremor in my hands, not from fear, but from the adrenaline finally leaving my system. It was the deepest exhaustion I knew, but it came with an equally deep calm. The knowledge that I had carried a mission and saved lives. That feeling was the only badge I ever needed. It stuck. I didn't ask for it, didn't claim it. But from that night on, that's what they called me in the field. And every time someone used it, I remembered that mission, that flight, that moment when fear and focus became the same thing. I never told my family. Not because I was hiding anything. I just didn't think they'd understand what that night meant. What does it cost? Or how I'd never been the same after. After that mission, the name traveled faster than I expected. Word got around, first in my unit, then across the base, and eventually through other squadrons. Reaper Queen started showing up on call sheets and locker room walls like some kind of legend. I was at a command briefing a few months later, 2,000 miles from my home base, when a general I'd never met nodded to me mid-lecture. "Our combat flight ops should take a page from the Reaper Queen's playbook," he said. The shift in the room was immediate. That's when I knew the name had outgrown my own unit. It wasn't about me, it was about the standard of work I'd set. I never asked for it, never introduced myself that way, but every time someone said it, there was a shift in their tone, a flicker of respect that came without question or doubt. There were moments when it almost felt like I was living a double life. On base, people nodded when I walked past. Pilots I'd never met saluted with a little extra sharpness. But the second I came home, it was like flipping a switch. No one in my family knew. I kept it that way on purpose. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't want that name to turn into a story they could twist into something casual. I didn't need to see it become another anecdote between beers. Oh, Isabel? Yeah, she's got some nickname at work. Something about a reaper. I could hear them already, laughing like it was cute. So I let them think I was background. The quiet cousin. The paper pusher. It was easier than explaining why I never slept well. Why I stared too long at empty skies. Why I jumped when I heard the wrong kind of silence. And sometimes, I wondered if keeping it all to myself was just a different kind of burden, carrying that name like a secret medal, earned in fire but hidden in shadow. Still, I never regretted it. The ones who needed to know already did. Out there, in that world, Reaper Queen meant something. Back home, Isabel was enough. The call came just as I was setting my drink down. My phone buzzed twice, the distinct vibration pattern I'd assigned for base alerts. I excused myself from the table and walked toward the driveway, away from the noise and the smell of grilled meat. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quick request for a schedule confirmation, something that could have waited, but always felt urgent in the moment. I answered, handled it in under a minute, and turned to head back. As I walked toward the patio, I pulled my keys from my pocket. They jingled as I spun them on my finger. And that's when it happened. Frank saw the tag. A small metal keychain, barely the size of a dog tag, with black lettering that read, Reaper Queen. I clipped the keys onto my belt loop and sat down like nothing had happened, but I could feel his eyes on me, searching, trying to connect dots he didn't know were there before. He leaned back slightly, brow furrowed, eyes locked on the small tag. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, voice lower and stripped of all its usual volume. I didn't answer right away. That name, that call sign, it meant something to him. For the first time all day, he wasn't the loudest guy at the table anymore. Frank stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly against the patio concrete. His face had gone pale, like the blood had drained out in a rush. Eyes locked on me, then down to the key tag still clipped to my belt. "You're the Reaper Queen?" His voice cracked in the middle, soft and raw, in a way I'd never heard from him. The whole table fell silent. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations dead in their tracks. I didn't say anything, just nodded once, quiet and steady. That was all it took. He blinked fast, then looked down at his hands like they weren't his anymore. "You flew into that kill zone? To pull Don's team out?" His voice was barely above a whisper now. "That was you?" I nodded again, this time slower. "Yeah, that was me." He looked like he'd been hit with a wave he didn't see coming. The bravado, the sharpness gone. In its place was something softer, almost reverent. I never knew. Don said it was a woman. Said she flew like death with wings. We all thought he was exaggerating. Frank let out a breath and sat down hard, like his legs gave up on him. No one said a word. The kids kept playing in the background, blissfully unaware. But every adult at that table was staring at me now, not with confusion, but with something else. A kind of stunned respect. Inside, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel proud. I felt exposed. Like the one part of my life I kept safe. It had been placed under a microscope. Frank shook his head slowly. "I treated you like some desk jockey. All this time, and you're out there doing that?" His voice cracked again, and for a second, he looked older than I remembered. I met his eyes, calm and even. "You didn't know. It's okay." But part of me knew it wasn't. After that day, things changed. Not in any loud or obvious way, but I felt it in the small moments. The way Frank greeted me first when I arrived. The way my aunt stopped asking what I did and started asking how I was holding up. He never brought up the nickname again, not directly. But a few weeks later, he handed me a coin, one of his old Marine Challenge coins, and said nothing as he passed it into my palm. I didn't need words. That gesture told me everything. I started hearing my name in different tones. Not the careless way people toss around a label. There was weight to it now. Pause, thought, sometimes even pride. And I didn't do anything different. I still came late when duty called, still left early if the phone buzzed. But I didn't shrink into the background anymore. I didn't pretend their stories mattered more than mine. I let them see me. Not the rank, not the call sign. Just Isabel. The woman who showed up, who did her job, who didn't ask for anything but showed she was worth something anyway. Frank apologized once, in his own way. We were standing by the grill again, months later. He handed me a burger and said, "Hell of a thing you did out there." Then he looked me in the eye. I should have known better. I just nodded and said, "The past is clear, Uncle Frank. Now you know." Respect wasn't something I waited for anymore. I carried it in how I walked, how I listened, how I stood my ground. I didn't raise my voice to earn it. I just stayed solid. And over time, they adjusted. I never needed them to call me Reaper Queen. I never needed them to understand every detail. I just needed them to stop seeing through me. Looking back, I realized something simple. You don't always get the credit you deserve, at least not when you want it. But when you show up as your full self, again and again, without apology, the world eventually catches on. Respect isn't given, it's revealed. And when you live in your truth long enough, it becomes impossible to ignore.